Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Debbie Cifuentes Ramirez. I'm a Spanish major, and I will be going to graduate school. I got accepted to UT Austin, their Spanish and Portuguese PhD program. Yeah. Cool. Okay. So my project is called Hacia el Norte, the representations of Guatemalan and Salvadoran immigrants in the lives, the tattooed soldier, and Mellon and Castro's Odyssey to the North. So before I begin my presentation, I would like to thank all of you for being here and providing us a supportive environment to share our research. I also want to thank the Mellon Undergraduate Fellowship, Professor Benjamin, and Grinnell College for working together and to allow me to do so. I'm also grateful for my cohort and those before me and after me. And I wanted to time to thank the Writing Lab. Their tutors have been really helpful, and particularly Judy Hunter and Jennifer McGovern. Lastly, and most importantly, I would like to thank my advisor, Professor Yvette Aparicio, who has really provided me with an immense amount of knowledge and words of advice. So this project came about because of my mother, who I also have to thank. She immigrated to the U.S. from Guatemala to seek economic stability that unfortunately she was not able to obtain in her home country. She hoped that by working in the U.S. for a year or so, she was going to be able to obtain enough funds to go back home and open her school. As I speak to her now, she tells me that immigrating was not as easy as it was told. The narratives that I study in my project clearly illustrate this struggle that needs to be recognized. So as I began researching, I found that when people discuss the immigrant experience, particularly post 9/11, usually people think of someone moving from a home country to a host country for financial gain. In this view, immigrants are seen to threaten the host country's security and development. Unfortunately, due to the ubiquity of this meta-narrative, other motives and hardships are ignored. Causes of Central American mass migration, in particular, can include political, social, and economic instability, yet some of them go unnoticed. For instance, the U.S. has a large population of Guatemalan and Salvadoran asylum seekers who are oftentimes mistakenly classified as economic immigrants. The narratives I study illustrate that political motivation is very strong, and in reality, immigrants coming after 1970 can actually share both economic and political motivations. So the new immigrant narratives I study provide the voiceless for the voice that challenge the meta-narrative that has been undermines their multifaceted experiences and which deserve the same attention as any other. So for my research, I examined two novels, Odyssey to the North by Maria Van Castro, a Salvadorian, and The Tattooed Soldier by Eto Tovar, a Guatemalan American. I looked at the literary portrayal of the immigrants' journey north during the Guatemalan and Salvadorian civil wars in 3 stages. From its initiation, when they leave their countries, to the challenges they face when they cross the multiple borders, to their struggles to adapt and become accepted in the U.S. I also illuminate these texts by examining both historical and ethnographic research to show how these authors go beyond the traditional immigrant experience to expose the hidden reality. So, because of Castro's and Tovar's ability to challenge the economic immigrant experience, both Odyssey to the North and The Tattooed Soldier have characteristics that exemplify what Barbara Harwood categorizes as resistance literature. These novels both appropriate and challenge presuppositions of immigration. Castro and Tovar provide us with a historical analysis of the circumstances of economic, political, and cultural domination and oppression in Central America that exposes the trials undergone by many asylum seekers at home and in the U.S. Beginning with the first stage, Guatemala and El Salvador have faced similar political and economic crises, which have resulted in the unequal distribution of power and wealth. influencing the country's economies and class structures. In both countries, resources have been controlled by a very small group of elites, while the poor have gotten poorer. In the 1970s, citizens of these countries decided that they were no longer going to accept such abuse, and discontent among people such as leftists, group workers, peasants, union workers, academics, and students gave rise to armed opposition groups. The oligarchy, allied with the military, responded to these leftist groups with violent repression and regularly committed human rights violations. Throughout this time period, 1960 to 1996 in Guatemala, and 1980 to 1992 in El Salvador, being part of or associating with such groups put your life at risk. 200,000 Guatemalans and 7,500 Salvadorians died around this period. Guatemala and Salvadorians saw no hope in their countries and preferred to die trying to find a safe haven abroad rather than doing nothing and allowing fear and hunger to kill them. So in The Odyssey to the North, Calixto's experience, Ben Castro's protagonist, presents to the reader the effects of being considered a threat to the Salvadoran government. Like the many thousands of Salvadoran citizens who were wrongly accused of subversive activities, Calixto is forced to flee his country. After several death squad members arrive at his house, a neighbor warns Calixto's wife that he has been labeled as an enemy of the government. Confused and aggravated, Calixto tells his wife that it must be a mistake or someone sawned him. Even though Calixto denies being involved in politics, nothing can be done because he will not be given the opportunity to legally challenge such accusations. Due to the Salvadorian government's agenda to remove all those who fill the country's soil with leftist ideologies or a cancerous disease, the remedy was to use deadly force against them. Many, like Calixto, had no other choice than to flee. So Antonio, from The Tattooed Soldier, Tovar's main character, is another example of forced migration. He and his wife were seen as a threat to the Guatemala status quo. As a result of the protagonist's wife's human rights activism, she and Antonio become targets and are labeled as impediments to national security. His wife only hoped to address inequalities in order to live in a better country. But her work to expose injustices backfired and made her and Antonio part of a nest of troublemakers in the government's eyes. His family's murder demonstrates that if you were targeted, you had to leave the country or you would be killed. Or they would kill you, sorry. The government's search for a healthy nation through repression and violence pushed many Guatemalans to leave their loved ones, their home, and their identity behind. Okay, so fleeing Central Americans saw the U.S. as a land of freedom and prosperity, and thus the answer to their problems. Here, we are in the second stage of the migration process, having to cross borders for a new beginning. With a stomach empty but a soul full of hope, many embarked on a journey that would expose them to additional dangers that impact the identities they would develop. As presented in Odyssey to the North, documentaries, and ethnographic research, in order to save themselves, immigrants had to cross 2 to 3 borders to reach the promised land. To try their luck, because in their own countries, things were going from bad to worse. In search of a better life, immigrants put themselves in multiple horrendous situations that made them susceptible to physical, mental, economic, and emotional abuse. As Maria Cristina Garcia notes, immigrants are vulnerable to robberies, violence, malnourishment, exploitation, rape, poverty, diseases, physical, psychological trauma, and death. Their lives are in the hands of the coyotes, gang members, corrupt authorities, both U.S. and Mexican, and citizens of both countries willing to and able to abuse immigrants. As Ben Castro's characters inform the reader, here at the border you could find your fortune, but also your death. Unfortunately, immigrants suffering as they cross the border only prepares them for the future abuse and exclusion with which the U.S. welcomes them. During the third stage, the reader sees Central Americans mold their identities to decrease their chances of being detained and sent back to their home country. Arturo Arias explains this transformation in great detail and blames it for the immigrants' invisibility. This is evident when the coyote tells his border crossers that they must speak, act, and even think like a Mexican in order to attract the least amount of attention. Central Americans are fugitives both in their own countries and the ones they cross, making for a journey full of agony. Their search for financial security, freedom, and most importantly, relief from their haunting past is difficult to obtain with the additional obstacles they have to face in the U.S. As the tattooed soldier illustrates, Antonio had an electric idea of Los Angeles, one that was a place of vibrant promises. Due to the unrealistic portrayals of the land of opportunity and other immigrants' depictions of their lives abroad, which oftentimes were false, new immigrants do not realize that in the U.S., life is as hard, if not harder, than the one they left back home. Calixto, for example, is flooded by the memory of his home in El Salvador and the difficulties that he faced, and he realizes that little or nothing had changed for him. He was suffering in this country too, and he wasn't sure if it was better to be here or there. Immigrants do not expect the cold shoulders they receive both by the U.S., in this particular case, that is not willing to provide them with political asylum, or their own people who see them as a threat. Bencastro and Tovar, as well as many academics, have recognized that Salvadorians and Guatemalans are depicted as constituting perhaps the most vulnerable national origin group, because their claim to refugee status has never been recognized despite their numbers, and therefore have been forced to internalize a sense of cultural inferiority. In addition to crushed dreams, immigrants deal with the hardships of preserving their identities while lacking legal ties to their home country and the receiving country. Some feel forced to take on new identities and assimilate in order to be accepted in the dominant culture. This phenomenon can clearly be seen with Calixto's co-worker, Juancho, who Americanizes his name to Johnny in the Odyssey to the north, and Jose Juan, who hopes to marry part for legal status in the tattooed soldier. Calixto, on the other hand, does not accept this fate. It's impossible to change your identity overnight, he says. Instead, many immigrants take pride in both cultures, and thus migrating to the U.S. is not about complete assimilation. As Linda Craft posits, identity is never fixed, but fluid, and the immigrant does not need to sacrifice his past to the demands of the present. According to Calixto, it does not matter where immigrants are located. There will always be a connection to the land from which they came. Unfortunately, keeping this strong sense of self can be difficult because, as Antonio says, his strength slipped away once across the border, lost in translation, placing him in what Cecilia Menjivar calls legal and avid cultural limbo. As I have shown, Mario Bencastro and Nico Tovar create a space where faces and nameless immigrants find their identities and create their own history. Like Bencastro and Tovar, I hope to help communicate that the Central American immigration process is significant and distinct from the meta-narrative. They cross multiple borders to the U.S., negotiate their identities as they cross Mexico, and lastly must adapt and continue to recreate their identities in the U.S. The meta-narrative that meshes immigrants together does not do justice to Central Americans and other groups who put their lives at risk to improve their living conditions. As Ana Patricia Rodriguez states, texts such as these bring to the fore Central American identities, imaginaries, and bodies of knowledge from their marginality. They are speaking out of their silence, disenfranchisement, violence, making their narratives distinct and recognizable rather than invisible. I too encourage the analysis of immigrant narratives that portray the other realities and critique and challenge the stories that are told by the dominant culture. Texts like Odyssey to the North and The Tattooed Soldier give the readers the opportunity to hear invisible and untold stories of Central Americans like my mother's. Thank you.